My name is Owen Symes, and welcome to the Copagandists, a podcast about cop shows and the people who make them. This week's episode, Reading Playboy for Fun and Profit, or How I Learned to Stop Masturbating and Read the Articles. Jordan Peterson will be proud, I'm sure. This is an episode about historical methodology, and I'm going to begin with a quote. What is most amazing and refreshing is that the past usually speaks for itself. The evidence is there for telling the great story of the American past honestly, with flaws, absolutely, with shortcomings, most definitely. But we think that an honest evaluation of the history of the United States must begin and end with the recognition that compared to any other nation, America's past is a bright and shining light. That's from the 2004 book A Patriot's History of the United States by Larry Schweikart and Michael Allen. Now, whatever you want to say about the United States as a moral entity, these authors, however they think about their own relationship with the past, are not historians. A real historian would never say that the past speaks for itself. People speak for it. Historians, for our part, try to do so via the logical evaluation of pertinent, authenticated evidence. Now, this evidence is indirect, since no one is able to get an objective view of an event while it occurs. This evidence is also incomplete because time destroys everything. This evaluation is biased because people can only evaluate from their own perspective. What makes history writing different than mythology, legend, or memory is that it treats evidence skeptically, carefully, and transparently. Real historians take a skeptical look at the authenticity of a document and the potential biases of its author. They consider the proximity of a text to what it describes and the competence of its authors to write it, and they ensure that whatever evidence they use is presented to the reader so that they can check the work for themselves. To say that the past speaks for itself thus does a double injury. It strips the historian of their contribution to the world, of giving people an evidence-based narrative of their past, and it lulls readers into taking the author as an unimpeachable authority. Those who purport to recite objective reality with absolute certainty may be prophets, poets, or charlatans. They are not historians. Historians deal in rationally deduced probabilities. That's all. Evidence is often categorized based on its proximity to an event. Primary evidence is created during or right after an event, secondary evidence long after an event, and tertiary evidence further out still. Primary evidence typically describes an event, memos, letters, diaries. Secondary evidence summarizes and analyzes an event, biography, for instance, and tertiary evidence organizes existing research, so an encyclopedia. Historians need to use logic to judge the veracity and utility of this evidence, and this logic is based upon the general knowledge of the historian. Now, this presents a problem. I do not work in television. I am not a professional filmmaker or scriptwriter. How then do I ascertain the general knowledge required to write a book that deals with the history of television production? Historians should take this question seriously. Most of what they write, they do not have any direct experience or professional knowledge of. They need to treat this with humility. That humility basically boils down to recognizing one's own ignorance and seeking out the requisite expertise to correct it. In my own case, that meant reading what TV professionals had to say about their own work, what TV observers had to say about that work, and what other TV historians have had to say. And it also meant dabbling in audiovisual production, trying to figure out the basics and the rudiments of this kind of work, both on my podcast and on YouTube. Almost all the shows that I'm currently researching were produced, broadcast, and discussed before the internet came into being. So instead of news websites, forums, and social media posts, I've had to turn to newspapers and magazines. TV Guide has been a major primary source, as has Variety when I can track them down. But perhaps the most surprising source of contemporaneous interviews and commentary is Playboy magazine. In a way, Playboy was the internet before the internet, a combination of advertising, current events commentary, interviews with celebrities, and of course, pornography. Reading through a given issue is thus reminiscent of many an internet browser history, as the voracious mind switches gears from the current crisis in the Middle East to an advertisement for electronics and over to a giant pair of milkers. If you've ever heard someone claim with a straight face, no, I only read Playboy for the articles, I wouldn't necessarily believe them, but it is indeed true the magazine had, from a 21st century vantage point at any rate, surprisingly good non-pornographic content back in the day. It's like if Pornhub also employed media critics and reporters that knew what they were doing. I first came upon the idea of investigating Playboy's online archive after reading through a series of Michael Mann interviews in some old film magazines. Some TV producers, like Quinn Martin, didn't give the press too many interviews, at least not in the publications I've been able to track down so far. But Mann didn't seem to mind the press. In fact, he seems quite comfortable talking both about the craft and the commercial aspects of filmmaking. So I thought maybe he had sat down with Playboy back in the day and given them a long-form interview. But I put that aside for the time being, as I had a number of other sources to go through first, notably a box of TV guides I'd recently purchased from eBay. A while later, I came across a reference to actor Don Johnson, one of the stars of Miami Vice, and his posing for Playgirl magazine, the women's alternative to Playboy. That reminded me that Playboy might be worth checking out, so I tracked down a few book-length compilations of their interviews. Didn't find anything with Michael Mann or actually any people that I was interested in reading about. So I fired up a VPN, put my browser in incognito mode, that way Jesus doesn't know what I'm doing, and went to their website to see if they had an archive. And lo, they did. I searched for Michael Mann, and while I didn't turn up any interviews with the man himself, I did find a number of articles pertaining to his TV work and the work of other producers that I'm interested in covering. Oh, it costs money to actually access and read these documents. Fuck. But it's only $8 for a month's subscription. So I paid up and plugged in, spending the next few days combing through their search feature, plugging in every show name, actor, and major behind-the-scenes person I could think of. The result was a surprising wealth of information. So having said all that, here's a list of 5 articles I came across that I found historically interesting and pertinent to my research. I'll be judging each one based on the evidentiary criteria I set up earlier. In screenwriting, that's called setup and payoff. Or is that Chekhov's gun? I don't know, tell me in the comments, I'm not an expert. Those criteria were authenticity of a text, proximity of its creation to the event, bias of its creator. Number 1. A word from our sponsors. A December 1959 article written by Al Morgan, a writer and TV producer. This tackled the problem, as he saw it, of sponsor-induced censorship on TV. Opposite a page telling readers about the quest of a number of young French directors to find the next Brigitte Bardot, Morgan goes into considerable detail about the kinds of creative infringement those with the money were then visiting upon the makers of TV programs, including the time Rod Serling's attempt to get something on TV about Emmett Till was torpedoed, suffering the death of 1,000 sponsor-induced changes. How are we to judge this article? In terms of authenticity, is it really a 1959 article written by the real Al Morgan? We can verify this in 2 ways. The first is an appeal to authority. Playboy at the time was an established magazine. Why would it lie? The second is independent internet searching outside the Playboy archive. Now, there are copies of this specific physical issue of the magazine for sale online, and their descriptions do include this very article. Given that Playboy doesn't have a reputation for deception, and given that physical copies of the issue seem to exist, I don't see any reason for any undue skepticism of its authenticity here. As for proximity, Morgan wrote his article in the middle of the events he's describing and analyzing. This means it has the potential to tell us a great deal about what contemporaries were thinking about this state of affairs. As for bias, the article certainly has plenty, and obviously so. It's written from the perspective of a frustrated artist and craftsperson, sick and tired of what he considers to be the censorship of the money-addled and donkey-brained. Obviously, a counter article written by the chief executives of one of those sponsors would sing a different tune, maybe with a focus less on thoughtful, expressive art and more on something that's consistently profitable, without which, he might say, TV would not be able to exist. We should take Morgan's arguments seriously, but, especially given my own baseline sympathy with his position, his conclusions about the state of the industry should be treated skeptically, rather than being taken at face value. Even if his criticisms have merit, his conclusions might not. And this is an important lesson for any of us analyzing a piece of media. If you already agree with what they're saying, you might want to treat it with a little bit more skepticism and just double check that the sources that they're citing, the anecdotes they're presenting, the statistics that they give you are actually true. It's really easy for us to just believe something because we want to. Article number 2, an October 1975 review of the current media landscape. Here, the Playboy editors poke fun at the fact that the networks were trotting out all these new Law and Order shows with supposedly unorthodox protagonists. This detective, he's fat. This one, he's old. This cop is bald. This one, he's young and hip, and so is his partner. They then give an award for most unorthodox show, but it's an 8-way tie. They then ask rhetorically, has there ever been a new crime series in the annals of TV police science with a star who wasn't unorthodox? Judging the authenticity of the text, as before, I have no reason to doubt that Playboy fabricated this entry, but just for the sake of double-checking, I did verify that copies of the physical version are for sale on eBay, although the listing I found didn't have a table of contents. As for proximity, it's written as the TV season it's judging was in the process of airing. As for bias, clearly the critics at the magazine did not have a lot of love for the fiction factory then churning out content for US television networks. This means that, while they may be correct in establishing a pattern for the kinds of cop characters then being broadcast, the pattern might be overblown or oversimplified. Although I can tell you both from watching many of the shows they list and from reading a number of other critics from the day, they're basically on the money here. Every era has formulas to be emulated, and the police procedurals of the mid-1970s, alas, did not shoot very high. Number 3, a June 1976 article by John Leonard, a well-known TV critic of the era, called "And a Picture Tube Shall Lead Them." It's about the dominance of TV in U.S. life, how even intellectuals had succumbed to watching shows about as much and of the same kind as the TV of the hoi polloi, how TV journalism had eclipsed print, how the medium of TV had become, in his words, the sea we swim in, and whether this fact has had any fundamental effects on U.S. policy and social cohesion, as critics at the time like Pat Buchanan alleged with sometimes apocalyptic language. His conclusion is that whatever its faults, TV has become the quote-unquote common language of the nation. He summarizes, "It's flimsy glue, but for the moment, it's the only thing holding us together." In terms of authenticity, I found reference to this same article in a 1978 paper from the University of Windsor, though don't worry, Leonard's article seems to have been reprinted since its initial publication in Playboy, so the scholarly citation is to the article's appearance in American Mass Media, Industries and Issues, edited by Atwin, Orton, and Vesterman. Happily, archive.org has a digital copy of this book available. If we take a quick gander at that copy and check the acknowledgments, yes, this book indicates that the original publication of Leonard's article was indeed Playboy magazine. Authenticity established. As for proximity, it's being written in the middle of the phenomena it seeks to unpack. In terms of bias, the author, who was a major critic at the New York Times at the time, had been writing about TV for nearly a decade by this point. It's his livelihood. There's a chance, therefore, that his notions regarding the importance of the medium he's chosen to stake his career on could be colored. Also, his description of former Nixon staffer Pat Buchanan as a flunky, and his criticism of both the recent government and corporate scandals rocking the country, paint him as more liberal, politically speaking. With those biases in mind, there's definitely something to be said for his description of network TV as it stood in the late 1970s as a kind of cohesive force. It's a thesis I've seen articulated elsewhere, and convincingly. And it's certainly something that we've lost in our media landscape today, with an algorithm for every individual. And we're living through the consequences of that, the disintegration of common reality that's come with that fragmented media landscape. Moreover, his description of the sensation of meeting a TV personality, in this case a reporter, does still ring true today. Quote, "It was not that they were necessarily better reporters, but they were themselves occasions, events, importance made corporeal. So much of our consciousness consists of television images that to meet the embodiment of one of these images is somewhat like meeting what it is you think you know, the contents of your own head." Also, and this is a small point, but early in the article he mentions that the late and esteemed cultural critic Lionel Trilling had been fond of the cop show Kojak. I can't help but mention that in reference to an October 1975 issue where a reader queried the magazine about different ways his female partner could keep her bush shaved clean, but without the hassle and discomfort of razors. The reply recommended, quote, "Since your wife was turned off by the discomfort of daily shaving, you might reserve the Kojak caper for special occasions. Do it for a day, then let the hair grow back." For anyone not familiar with the show Kojak, the joke here, Kojak was a bald detective.
I love you, baby.
Article number 4. An interview from July 1979 with Joseph Wamba. This is an extremely interesting interview, especially compared to some of Wamba's later public statements. In a nutshell, Wamba was an LAPD cop turned successful author, who then tried to break into Hollywood in the mid-1970s. He had some very high-profile creative and legal battles with producers and studios, tried to go independent and adapt his own work himself, then washed his hands of Hollywood by the end of the decade. Documents at the time, like Contemporary TV Guide reporting, recounts a lot of this drama, although Wamba himself has softened his language as he's reminisced about these things decades later. This interview thus gives us a wonderful dose of Wamba as he was at the time. Angry. Here's a good quote. "I mean, how dare a producer or a studio executive who is a Harvard lawyer or worse, how dare he say he's in a better position to understand plot, character, and dialogue than a writer? And yet each and every one of those guys thinks he can do it, even though movies are nothing more than stories on celluloid instead of on the printed page." His most famous TV work remains the anthology show Police Story, which he created as a vehicle to showcase what he considered the emotional violence that police often experienced on the job, not just the physical violence that they infrequently experienced, and which most cop shows at that point preferred to display. He created the show and consulted on it, but it was run by the executive producer David Gerber. In this interview, he calls Gerber a very aggressive producer who tried to walk the line between what Wamba wanted to create and what NBC wanted to broadcast, telling him, "Okay, that's one script for the Irish Art Theater. Now let's have a couple of bang bang shows for the network." In judging this document, eBay listings indicate that it's authentic. There are physical copies of this issue, which include the Wamba interview in their descriptions. As for proximity, it's very proximate. Wamba is being interviewed right as his Hollywood career is coming to an end, so his recollections and opinions were still fresh. As for bias, it's intense and obvious. This needs to be considered, especially when he describes the various Hollywood producers that he had to work with. At the same time, I haven't come across any reason to presume that his narrative of events is intentionally deceitful. It's just that his interpretations tend to be very passionate. So we can't just quote him verbatim and assume that that's exactly how things happened. Okay, number 5. May 1982 article called "Real Men Don't Eat Quiche" by Bruce Firestein. In the narrative of the article, upon being confronted at a rest stop by a man named Flex Crush, a pensive nuclear waste truck driver, the author starts asking the tough questions. How, in a world in which you're expected to be sensitive, sympathetic, and split half the household chores, do you remain a real man? Is it possible to have relationships and shared experiences without turning into Alan Alda? Are we doomed to abandon the principles of strength, dignity, and Sylvester Stallone forever? Is there a way to accept the concept of the female orgasm and still command the respect of your foreign auto mechanic? The article goes on to list advice for defining what a real man is, what his credo should be, his wardrobe, his preferred automobiles. It lists great moments in great man literature. Actually, there's only one, and it comes from the autobiography of G. Gordon Liddy. Great moments in real men history. And happily for our purposes, a section covering real men and television. This part bemoans the exodus of great men from the tube, but gives advice, including a helpful schedule of manly shows, to get them back to watching. It's hilarious and frustratingly topical in an era of the Liver King and the testosterone nobility that infect social media. In judging this document's authenticity, the essay was subsequently turned into a book of the same title. Archive.org, MVP, has a copy, and wouldn't you know it, right at the start it says portions of this were originally in Playboy magazine. Check, authentic. As for proximity, it's poking fun at what was then a contemporary cultural trend, one that has remained contemporary to this very day. As for bias, the satirical nature with which he treats the topic, plus an article I found of his from 2021 called "So You Want to Become a Republican? First a Questionnaire," lead me to think that Fierstein is on the more liberal end of the political spectrum. This means that, whatever the realities of the fragile masculinity trend he observed in the 1980s, it's possible he's strawmanning here. I mean, given the existence of men like Andrew Tate, I don't think that's the case, but I mean, it's possible, and a good historian should keep that in mind. That's 5 examples of documents I excavated from the depths of Playboy magazine. What they were about, why they were pertinent to my research, and how I tried to evaluate them as potential sources of historical information. As we move forward in this podcast, it's these kinds of sources and methods that I'll be relying upon to create this content. I hope you try and apply them to analyzing the narratives in your own life and the media that you come across. Next week, we'll start talking about an actual propagandist, the legendary Jack Webb. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Music by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Find me at Instagram, Owen_Symes, Blue Sky, Owen-Symes, YouTube at Integral History, and check out my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years.